Hi, this is Gerry Conway, and you're listening to Amazing Spider Talk.
Two men who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The Amazing Spider Talk. The Amazing Spider Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the Amazing Spider Talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I'm the founder and editor of AmazingSpiderTalk.com, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, and I want to be very clear, that includes the annuals.
Yes, and I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and author of 100 Things Spider-Man fans should know and do before they die, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, and as a published author, Dan, I think I have the authority to say the annuals don't count.
Whoa! See, now you're going to hold that over me from now on. This is your credentials. All right, that's fair.
Dropping the bomb.
That's fair. That's fair, Mark. Well, to all of you, thank you for joining us for this 7th episode of the 3rd season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
If you want to learn everything we know about Spider-Man, why not subscribe to our show starting back with the first season?
You can enjoy our show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or your podcast player of choice. We'd love to have you along for our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future. So just head on over to AmazingSpiderTalk.com for all the details about where to subscribe.
Yes, and in this 3rd season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, we've been following our favorite web-slinger through the transition into the Bronze Age, a time period that is known for its darker tone and sometimes outlandish stories. And speaking of which, Dan, today we wanted to take a look at the sometimes odd stories that, while not maybe deserving of their own episode, they're influential in their own right. So I guess we're kind of doing this hodgepodgey potpourri episode.
Mark, this might be our biggest stretch ever for one of these episodes. This is like our Mr. Fantastic episode.
Yes. Who are 3 people who have not been in my kitchen, Alex?
So if you want to read along with us, and I'm saying, like, bear with me on these numbers here. We're going to be talking about events from Amazing Spider-Man issues 108 and 109, 115, 120, 123, 126, 127, 130, 131, 138, 142 through 143, 156, 157, 160.
Oh my.
And Spectacular Spider-Man's numbers 8 and 13 through 15. Did you get all that, everybody? If you didn't, just hit that rewind button until you write them all down. Or you can just check the show notes and they'll be there.
That is exhausting just listening on this end, Dan. I'm sorry.
It was exhausting to corral all that. I don't even know if anybody's going to use it, but I thought, okay, there's going to be one person out there that's like, I want to know what they're talking about. I'll read along. And maybe there's more than that, and I'm giving everybody short shrift. But as always, we're going to be talking about these from a helicopter view, so don't worry if you haven't read them. We're going to kind of summarize what's happening, because that's kind of the bulk of this episode. But, if you do want to read along, all of these comics are very easy to find. They're all available in print, in collections. They're available digitally. And I think nearly all of them are on Marvel Unlimited, save for maybe a Spectacular Spider-Man or two, because they haven't really uploaded that whole series quite yet.
Yeah, this is the opposite of the Marvel Team-Up episode we just did. Like, this one is actually pretty accessible.
Although they do have the full the full Byrne Claremont run on Marvel Unlimited, I came to find. So, there you go. Well, that was a lot of talking from us, Mark. Let's get into the show. So let's hop in our Spider-Mobile, drive out to Rockaway Beach, and get ready to stop our aunt's wedding for our episode, Odds and Ends.
With great powers, with also come great responsibilities. Don't grow by trying to kill yourself with your abilities. We're not talking about acting
actually got in trouble once because Ross was so good about wanting references for things. We did a story called Mindworm, about a character called the Mindworm. That's about this kind of mutant kid, who has this ability to do telepathic mind control or something. And Ross found this house in his neighborhood down in Howard Beach, Queens, that he thought would be a great house for this guy to be in because it was on this kind of the only house surrounded by vacant lots, and it was kind of eerie and weird. So he used it as a reference. Unfortunately, it was recognizable, and local fans started going to the house and asking if the Mindworm lived there. And Marvel ended up getting sued by the owners of the house, and we had to pay them off, I think.
So, Dan, I got to tell you, for this first topic here, I'm a little disappointed because when we were talking about season 3 ideas, I was kind of holding adamantly that we got to do a whole episode to the greatest couple in Spider-Man history, Otto Octavius and Aunt May, right?
Yeah, of course.
They're a match made in heaven. And you were the one who put his foot down and said, absolutely not. I'm not wasting my time with this. Until we were like, we really have to talk about it in some context. So let's just throw it together with a bunch of other random stuff.
I mean, to my credit, like my assertion was this is important, but not important to spend an hour on.
So, yes, for those of you who really like this kind of stuff, all of the Otto Aunt May stuff we're referencing here started in Amazing Spider-Man's number 115, 120, 123, and 130 and 131. Although, technically, Dan, if you remember, all this really started back in Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1, the Sinister Six issue, right?
Yeah, that's true. You could really, good credit for them sticking with this. And Gerry Conway clearly was fond of that interaction in that book because he brought it back and made this whole big deal out of it. So, yeah, you're technically right. And I think we noted that then when we talked about that issue.
Yeah, I mean, Otto, May always has seemed a little sweet on Otto for reasons we don't know. And this storyline would get referenced. I mean, in Superior, there was that kind of very cheap played for laughs thing where, when Peter had Otto's memories, he remembered stuff about him and Aunt May. Yay. But really, I mean, in terms of their love affair, this kind of kicks off in 115 when Otto moves in with amnesia, mind you. He moves into Aunt May's building and he intercepts her mail. And what does he discover, Dan?
He discovers that May has inherited some large estate in Canada, I guess an island, although we don't find this out till much later. In fact, the characters all know this before we do. Even Spider-Man, it's revealed kind of haphazardly, but yeah, she has inherited this island with something on it that will come into play much later, which we'll get into in a moment.
This also kind of comes in during the midst of the introduction to Hammerhead and the Hammerhead Otto gang war. Well,
so then May, agrees to move in with Otto because he wants to have her nearby, right? Because he needs some caretaking, but he's like, if I know this about May, I can kind of bring her under my, umbrella and all this stuff. And the letter that May received was from this guy, Arthur Rimbaud. I'm guessing that's how you say his name. Although sometimes he's also referred to as Jean-Pierre. So it's another case of the Peter Palmerisms.
Yeah. Or was it Ben Banner? Or
Yeah, Ben Banner's another one. Yeah. For an issue. And the letter kind of tells her to go to Canada, and Peter finds out about this, and so he decides to go instead of May. But before he can talk to Arthur Rimbaud about it, Arthur is killed off kind of mysteriously because he knows about the estate that May is about to inherit. Then the stuff with Gwen goes down, and Peter goes to Gwen's funeral where Otto and May are attending the funeral, which has got to have been the worst shocker ever.
Right? Like when my one arch nemesis has killed my girlfriend, and then I have to see my aunt with my other arch nemesis. Come on.
Yeah, and then later in the snow, Peter finds an envelope that was planted by the Jackal, which tips him off as to why Otto is interested in May. And that's where Peter knows what she's inheriting, but we don't. The idea is that the Jackal put it there to kind of instigate a fight between Otto and Peter, hoping they would kind of kill each other off in some way. So Peter's at like a party with Betty, and so he like gets out of there and he goes up to the Westchester estate where May is living. And that's where he bursts, or he doesn't burst in yet. He sees through the window that there's a ceremony going on. And this is like one of the weirdest end of a comics ever, is that Otto is getting married to Aunt May in this like elaborate ceremony. It's quite insane. Because when you're a criminal mastermind trying to take advantage of an old woman, well, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. Spoiler, spoiler of a 40-year-old story. You know, it makes sense to like do a big elaborate ceremony instead of like, you know, trying to do a wedding in the quickest and most painless way possible, right? I love it because like Otto's in like a tux that accommodates his like extra arms. May looks like the stiffest she's ever looked. Like, she looks like nearly ready to die. Maybe it's just the pencils or something like that. But she's in this full wedding outfit. Like, when did they have time to go and get this gown for May? I just would love to see a series of stories detailing this whole, like, rigmarole. My favorite detail is that, like, one of Otto's henchmen is, like, in the background wiping away a tear with a hanky. Like, it's just absurd. I mean, I think in terms of absurdness, this or the Hammerhead ghost stuff is the most absurd that we got during the Bronze Age. Would you agree with that? There's some other stories we're about to get to that kind of, I think they're all pretty absurd, Dan. I mean, I think it's hard to pick a favorite here. I do like the detail when Hammerhead interrupts the wedding here, and Otto and May, they flee in a helicopter from an underground lair. It's so intricate. It's like, when did he have time to build all this stuff? It's so convenient. It's truly, I think, one of the biggest stretches for like a Spider-Man villain. You know, like Kingpin having like trap doors under his desk and all that stuff. Okay, fine. But like Otto having this whole secret Westchester estate, it's really a lot to buy. Because, like, you gotta, I mean, I don't mean to be overly pedantic here because it's comics, but, like, it's not, I mean, like, Kingpin, you know, like you said, he's established as, like, this kind of wealthy businessman. He's just crooked. I mean, he's a true mobster. Otto is not a mobster, even though they're trying to do this whole gang war thing. He's a criminal, you know what I mean? So, like, it's like, how does he have the means to develop something like this? Although I guess at the same time, our favorite Otto story, you know, he's got an underwater base. So, I mean, nothing is truly out of the realms of reach for this guy. Are we going to get into what this reveal is and what May has? Because, like, this might kind of correct what I was saying a few seconds ago, Dan. This might be the most absurd thing in Spider-Man comics history here. I think it is the most absurd thing in Spider-Man comics history. Mark, do you want to do the honors? Well, so apparently Aunt May, beautiful May, she has inherited a Canadian island that has, quote unquote, one of the richest supplies of uranium found in nature. My favorite thing is that there's already like an airfield built on this place, you know, and, quote, one of the world's most sophisticated nuclear breeding reactors already built on the site. Like, is anybody monitoring this? Like, why is this allowed to just go to someone's like old aunt? Like, is there no government overseeing this? Right. You know, because that's how this stuff works. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like that enriched uranium that we kept hearing about a couple of years ago. It's just, you know, like that's just how uranium works, Dan. Like, it just goes into the hands of people without any oversight whatsoever. My favorite thing is how Gerry like summarizes this literally on the page. Quote, May Parker has inherited the most modern privately owned atomic processing plant in the world. A plant that, in the wrong hands, could produce weapons powerful enough for a madman to wreak incredible havoc. Unquote. And wouldn't you know, Dan, that, like, you know, May happens to have access to many madmen because of her nephew. I mean, it's just like, what a coincidence, right? Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of like triggers a like war between Hammerhead and Ock. And it seems like Hammerhead has no idea what he's actually fighting for. He just kind of knows that something, you know, there's something that Otto wants. So like they're fighting, and eventually becomes clear to Hammerhead that it's like this nuclear reactor, which he can use to rule the underworld or something. But like Otto dives out of the way of one of Hammerhead's blows, and Hammerhead runs into the nuclear reactor, which triggers a nuclear explosion and an accompanying mushroom cloud, which apparently kills both. And I think truly earns Gerry Conway his role as the mass murderer on the Spider-Man title. I mean, has anybody killed off more characters than he did?
Truly, this is like nuking the fridge before it became a thing, right? Before Indiana Jones
Absolutely, absolutely. So the best detail is that Spider-Man managed to escape by like flying a plane with Aunt May on it out of there. And we never see him like land the plane or anything like that, or any follow-up on a giant nuclear fallout in Canada. Like, it's just completely swept under the rug. And, you know, you could say, oh, comics, whatever, but it's truly silly.
And May is like distraught, right? Like she is just like beside herself that this has all come to pot.
Yeah,
right?
she wakes up on the plane and sees that Spider-Man has like kidnapped her and Otto is not around anymore. And she like faints all over again. And you get some slight references to this from May, but mostly she kind of just like recovers a few issues later and is back to being old May.
As we referenced earlier, I mean, of course, this whole relationship would kind of be followed up on in like dribs and drabs over the course of the Bronze Age, including Otto showing up at another great event of holy matrimony, the Ned Leeds Betty Brant wedding, right?
Yeah, he like shows back up at May's place in like kind of like a bum's attire, and he's been kind of teased for a few issues, and you know, he comes back and moves in with May again for a little bit. It's a whole thing. And they have another Spider-Man fight. That story's pretty quickly resolved.
You know, in the modern era, I mean, Dan Slott would reference this quite a few times during the Superior run when he had, you know, basically was writing Otto's voice. But outside of that one little hardy har line of Peter witnessing something happening between the two of them, I mean, it feels more like Otto appreciates May and respects May and, you know, like, would do anything for her, but not necessarily romantically, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest moment of this is in Amazing Spider-Man 800, where, you know, Otto kind of sacrifices himself again in a way to save Aunt May from the Goblin Childy, as we call him. So yeah, that's Otto Octavius and Aunt May's wedding, which I don't know if it ever got to the point of being official. Was it officialized? I'm not quite sure. Is Otto, or was he at one point Peter's uncle?
I think it was always kind of considered almost uncle. So it must not have been officialized or notarized or consummated even.
Well, there you go. That would take J. Jonah Jameson is the other like person who eventually becomes a member of Spidey's family through Aunt May. So let's talk about the next one, and probably my favorite of the things we're going to be talking about today, and that is the introduction during the Bronze Age of the Spider-Mobile.
Yes, which you can find, of course, across these issues, 126, 127, Amazing Spider-Man number 126, 127, 130, 141, 157, 159, and 160. Is 160 my murderer, my car, or whatever the
it is. It is the great Mysterio storyline.
Yeah. This is absurd, but I think this is on a different level of absurd because this was also clearly, I've always viewed the Spider-Mobile as a cheap way to kind of cash in on Spider-Man's popularity and kind of create some off-comic marketing. Like, right? I mean, that seems pretty apparent to you,
in fact,
right?
I found a quote from Gerry Conway about this. I'm surprised we've never asked him about this on the show. This is what Gerry Conway had to say about the introduction of the Spider-Mobile, which is, he said, "This was a notion that Stan had. Stan was put in an odd position because he moved up from being an editor-writer to being the publisher of Marvel Comics in 1970 and 71. And as a result of that, his priorities towards how to find revenues for the company had changed. He was approached by, I think it was Hasbro, or it might have been Tonka Toys or something, who said, 'Listen, we found that what really works for toy characters, in addition to the figures, is if they had a lot of cool stuff with them. Could you maybe give each of your characters a cool car?' And so Stan said, 'Sure.' He didn't have to do it. He told me, 'You know, Spider-Man needs to have a car.' And I'm like, 'Do you realize that Spider-Man swings on a web between buildings and the car would really slow him down doing that?' And he said, 'I don't care what you do with it, just do it.' So we played it for laughs and we sank it in, I think, the same issue. Not exactly true. They didn't sink it in the same issue, but like it seems like from the get-go, Gerry knew that the car was a joke. And I actually looked into this. The toy company wasn't Hasbro or Tonka Toys. It was actually the Mego company who did release a Spider-themed car, but it doesn't bear any resemblance to the actual Spider-Mobile. So I don't even know if all this whole thing was necessary at all in the first place. So why don't you tell everybody about what the Spider-Mobile is in the context of the comics?
The way this whole thing is introduced is Spider-Man meets these two folks, Carter and Lombardo, who basically look like Stan Lee and Roy Thomas. So, you know, nink, nink, nudge, nudge. And they're two ad men representing this company, Corona Motors. And they have this new engine that's non-polluting, and they want Spider-Man to build a car with their engine to promote it. So, you know, I mean, you know, if I could just sidebar for a second here, like, so Spider-Man, of course, we know that Peter has this science background, but this is like another instance of like, kind of like, well, what exactly is Spider-Man capable of doing? Like we have the web shooters, which I guess demonstrates mechanical engineering, but like now he's building cars. You know what I mean? Like,
I love that these guys just assume that like, oh, Spider-Man, he could build a car. And reality is not so much. First he says no, but then he realizes like that his rent is 2 months overdue. You know, complicated by the Harry Osborn stuff. You know, he goes back and says yes, and they reveal we don't actually have any plans for a vehicle. We just have this motor. So then he goes to the Baxter building and gets the Human Torch to help him out. And they kind of slowly build it in the background of a few issues.
Yeah, and which, you know, is important from a historical standpoint because, I mean, the Spider-Man Human Torch relationship had started it to thaw by this point anyway, but I feel like, and this of course would get mined much later in the Spider-Man Human Torch mini that we talked about in one of our Essential episodes. I mean, I do think kind of showing them together, being more cordial. I mean, they're, you know, they're ripping on each other throughout, but this does feel like this is actually becoming a genuine friendship now, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's less competition. It's like there's still ribbing, but there's a spirit of like friendliness to it that like I think is a real evolution from what came before, where they really just kind of, I don't know if they were friends before, but they were like very like actually mean to each other.
So, of course, my favorite thing about this whole thing is, you know, as Peter or Spider-Man is driving this thing, we, of course, come to the realization that Peter doesn't have a driver's license. So he's driving this car in Manhattan without a license, and he's terrible at it, of course. So
it's a real mess. One of the things I like to think about the Spider-Mobile, and, you know, I wrote into Amazing Spider-Man and got a letter of mine printed in one of the annuals. It was like a flashback annual with Captain America, where I was like goofing around and saying, you should create the spider plane. And, you know, when Spider-Man was like being invented as a character, it's like, well, what are the limits of this character? Would this guy drive a Spider-Mobile? I think the answer is clearly no. But one of the fun things to do if you go back and read the issues after the Spider-Mobile is introduced is how much fan backlash there was to the Spider-Mobile. Like people really wrote in and said like how incredibly stupid this idea was. Like Spider-Man should not drive a Spider-Mobile. And one of the letters I actually found said it broke the grounded reality of Spider-Man. Like, the car is what did it.
That's the line.
Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree. Like, if you were reading this and didn't know that Gerry Conway wasn't, like, joking about this, I think I would have had a pretty violent reaction to the appearance of the car as well. And I think Gerry finally reveals the joke when the car is first revealed and Spider-Man says, quote, "Now that's what I call a fiasco." Like that was like the reveal. But it's funny because one of the letters that was written in lambasting the book was from this guy, Steve Saffel, who went on to write this really great book, Spider-Man the Icon, which I know you and I both own. So it's funny seeing like old names pop up in the letters pages who would go on to kind of write the book on Spider-Man. Even the most hardcore fans were like, kind of like, what the hell is this?
We're obviously looking at this with hindsight and, you know, a more cynical eye in the 21st century, but I can't help but think that even then, people seeing this stuff is like, they were probably thinking, what kind of ploy is this? Like Spider-Man doesn't have a car, you know what I mean? I mean, it's one thing when his aunt's marrying Doc Ock because it's comics and that kind of works in a weird superhero melodrama standpoint, but this is just out of nowhere and it makes no sense because why would he drive a car?
Even the features of the car are like patently absurd, right? Like it's got a spider signal built in, which kind of hadn't been a fixture in the comics in quite a while at that point. Like I can't think of the last time we saw the spider signal at this point. And then it's got like a webbing switch where it can like web people up or maybe swing through the city, which it's like, did he share his web formula with the Human Torch? It made me wonder about that. And it's got ejector seats. And I love that the Human Torch's reason is like, just because, all these cars have to have ejector seats. I think there's even a point where Peter goes to like a party and he like flips a switch and the car like turns into like a Studebaker or something like that. It's like James Bond's car.
Does it play like La Cucaracha too on the horn? I mean, I hope so. That would be pretty swank. So of course, there is the inevitable car chase because it's a car. And it's with the police, and Mysterio actually sets up some fog affecting Spider-Man's visibility and making his bad driving even worse. And he crashes it into the Hudson. And I always love this. The cops basically just watch this car sink, thinking Spider-Man's in there drowning with it. And Spidey says, "My popularity is so low that the cops don't even want to dredge for my body." Wah, wah.
Well, Spider-Man himself goes dredging for the Spider-Mobile later. He like goes back down into the Hudson River and is like, I don't know what to do with this thing. Do I get it out of here? Like, I don't necessarily want it, but I have to deliver it to these guys. And so like the two guys like Carter and Lombardo from Corona Motors, they run a column in the Daily Bugle threatening to sue Spider-Man unless he can deliver the car, which it's like, how do you plan on doing that? Like, you're going to be like subpoena Spider-Man? I don't know how that works.
If Spider-Man can't even cash a check in his name, how is he going to get sued?
Yeah.
I don't know. But
But then the mystery like deepens because Spider-Man's like, oh crap, I got to do something with this. So he goes back there and then the car is gone except for like one side view mirror. And then like there's this tease in the book where we see these mysterious figures rebuilding the car, and it actually like signals the return of a major villain. Who is that, Mark?
It is none other than the return of the terrible Tinkerer, who was first seen and only seen in Amazing Spider-Man #2. Although the Tinkerer they would start using him a little more again. And then, of course, he showed up in Spider-Man Homecoming and then was in Chip Zdarsky's Spectacular run. But, yeah, this was the second appearance of the Tinkerer, Dan.
I think, like, clearly establishes that he wasn't an alien at that point in time, as was suspected. And so we get some retconning going on here. And then the joy of all joys is that the car starts chasing after Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, the car becomes semi-sentient here, right? Is that what we're led to believe?
Kind of, I guess. I think it's being controlled, but the weirdest thing is that suddenly the car can drive up walls like Spider-Man can.
Right. Makes sense to make that change now.
Of course. And so Spider-Man defeats the Tinkerer, destroys the car, and then returns it to Stan and Roy, or Carter and Lombardo, with a complimentary note. And it made me think, like, this is like, I think like the second or third time ever that we see Spider-Man's note appearing in the book. During this read through, I've kind of been trying to figure out when the first time he uses a handwritten note is. I think this is like the second or third time we see that.
It's also worth noting here that at this point, the book has like transitioned over to Len Wein, right? This is not Gerry anymore. So clearly someone got to Len to make him write more about the Spider-Mobile.
Everybody's favorite thing. Definitely worth crossing over multiple runs. Well, it would come back in the future, like you said. Where do we see the car again?
It comes back in the future, but let's be honest here. It comes back in the future because of Dan Slott. Because this is the kind of like weird, bizarre minutia from the past that Dan Slott just like eats with a spoon, right? Like he lives for this kind of stuff. We probably are not talking about the Spider-Mobile if not for Dan Slott, in my opinion, because like he just used this thing. He used it in the Spider-Man Human Torch mini that we mentioned earlier. I mean, basically built an entire episode around it. Then he also brings it back in Amazing Spider-Man number 600, as it's on display in the Smithsonian. It's in No One Dies in Amazing Spider-Man number 655 as part of that double-page tableau of people who have died under Spider-Man's watch.
I love that. That's like the best joke on that page.
And then, of course, part of Dan Slott's original pitch for Spider-Verse, which was to have every version of Spider-Man ever, was to have an alternative version of the Spider-Mobile being known as Peter's parked car. Waka waka.
I love that joke. We never get that actual name in the comic, but we do see the Spider-Mobile from another dimension that's a sentient version of the character, but I don't know why he couldn't just put that name in. Peter Parked Car is too funny.
And where else have we seen him that's not even Spider-Man technically?
Oh yeah, in the Old Man Logan book by Millar and McNiven, Logan and Hawkeye kind of travel around the desert, and the Spider-Mobile is how they drive. So it's one of those things, like, even in the apocalypse, the Spider-Mobile has survived.
There you go. And that's a non-Dan Slott story.
Yeah, and then another Dan Slott story, I guess, like, if you really want to extend this into evolutions of the Spider-Mobile, just like the spider armor, it would eventually get upgraded, and Peter would learn to drive and build an even more powerful version of the car in his kind of like Parker Industries era on the book.
The Spider-Mobile, Dan.
Love it. One of my favorite things ever. I'm so glad that it's come back, and these stories are great, especially if you know that they're written with like the tongue firmly planted in its cheek.
This episode wouldn't be possible without the support from our wonderful Patreon subscribers, whose patronage allows us to assemble the guests we have on the show and do all of our research. If you enjoy the show and want to help us continue, while also getting amazing bonus content and additional episodes that we never release publicly, go to our show notes and check out our Patreon page and consider joining our team.
Our next story we're going to talk about, I mean, I think this is probably, of all the things, the least absurd, although it's a superhero comic wedding themes storyline, so of course weird stuff happens during it.
And it's the setup for like truly weird things to come down the pike.
But I feel like the actual premise of this story is not weird in its own right. And that is the marriage of Ned Leeds and Betty Brant. The long sweethearts dating, going back to the Ditko Lee run, basically the man that Betty Brant leaves Peter for in the early 60s. And you can get these stories in Amazing Spider-Man issues 142, 143, 156. Why don't you lead us into what's going on here, Dan?
Sure. So like in issue 142, Ned and Betty break the news to everyone at the yet unnamed Coffee Bean, which, everybody's really excited about. And it causes Peter to kind of like reflect on their own history, because he's very like caught up in his own head about like the Gwen stuff and this kind of burgeoning romance with Mary Jane. So that's really interesting. It's weaved into the story pretty artfully, I feel like. But one weird thing I found when I was like rereading this is that like they tell everybody the date of the wedding is going to be August 27th. But if you go and read the issue where they get married, everybody there is in like their winter coats. So, either they delayed the wedding considerably or they forgot that was the date of the wedding. Like later on, like Peter, and Betty and Ned, they keep interacting with each other. And there's this one moment where Peter's trying to butter up Betty, and he tells her, quote, "You're the only girl I ever loved," and kisses her on the cheek, which I think is kind of fortuitous because there's a lot of shenanigans that go on. Like, Peter is not the best dude in the world, which is funny because when the wedding comes, Peter is the best man, which I think is pretty bold of Ned, considering that Peter was like his competition early on and Betty's like last ex, which like, good on you, Ned. You didn't deserve to have your throat slit and then come back and die again in rubble. Poor Ned. On that note, MJ is also the maid of honor in the wedding, which is also kind of weird because I don't feel like Betty and MJ have much of a relationship.
This feels like Saved by the Bell syndrome, where like these are the only 6 characters that exist in this universe, and thus they must do everything together.
Sure, because Betty's also being given away by Jameson, which like, I get it, he's her boss, but does she not have a dad?
I guess not. I mean, and I mean, didn't we establish too that Betty has a sister? I feel like that came up at one point. So like, shouldn't she have been the main? Whatever. I mean, comics.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of comics, it's a wedding, but a comic's wedding wouldn't be complete if it wasn't interrupted, including that, the Otto May wedding. So who interrupts this wedding, Mark?
Well, of course, Dan, this would be none other than one of Spider-Man's most notorious villains, the great Mirage, who, if you don't know who we're talking about, go reference that Steve Lieber artwork for our Patreon members that you received for the guy kind of crouching down in the corner there. Mirage, Dan, what's Mirage's deal?
He's got this strange yellow headset. I guess his whole outfit is yellow, but he looks almost like Galactus on a bad fashion day. He's got these V shapes coming off of his head, and he can use a 3D hologram projector thing to create alternate versions of himself, which is kind of a cool power, but he's just a jerk is really the best way to put it. I mean, some of these guys you can respect. Mirage is so full of himself. He is constantly boasting throughout the whole issue, and you just want to see Spider-Man deck him one, which he eventually does. And there's not really anything that interesting. He's just kind of there to rob all of these people having a wedding. So it wasn't even targeted. He's just kind of working his way through this venue, robbing everybody. And, obviously the Leeds Brant one is the last one he goes to because Spider-Man is there to stop him. So yeah, Mirage is defeated and everybody gets married, and it's happily ever after for Ned Leeds and Betty Brant.
Yeah, I mean, nothing ever really happened with them ever again, right?
No, not at all. So, I think it's special of note that they go on a honeymoon in Paris, where Ned is named the Bugle's foreign correspondent, which kind of kicks him out of the series for a while. I mean, he'll show up here and there, but he's kind of off doing things overseas. And right before the issue ends, Betty throws the bouquet to Aunt May, who kind of jokes, she's was Betty serious about that? Because it was a really targeted thing. And for me, that's the moment that Aunt May is forever doomed to be set up to have a series of near happily ever afters that end in horrible, depressing death.
Which is apropos, considering it came from Betty Brant. In all seriousness, Ned and Betty kind of have a rough relationship over the years. I mean, that's even putting aside Ned's eventual murder. But I mean, actually, this is kind of an interesting setup. I mean, it's, Ned is this kind of jet-setting, high-powered foreign correspondent, and that basically creates friction between he and Betty. I mean, which is a kind of a real relatable problem, right?
Yeah, except Betty then does some truly terrible stuff, because she shows back up in the States, because she's gone for a little while too, and she tries to have an affair with Peter, who I think is far too accommodating of it. He's kind of entertaining it for a little while.
Yeah, well, because he had just broken up with MJ, if memory serves. So he's kind of oh, yeah, oh, wait, well.
He tries to justify it by being Ned Leeds isn't that good of a guy. And it's wait a minute, weren't you his best man?
Shows what that means.
It's one of those moments where Peter is kind of truly being a scumbag. It's the Deb Whitman stuff. You're Peter, come on, man.
Definitely Peter the Cad here. And then, but she would eventually get that affair with Flash Thompson, who, unfortunately is far more understanding that he would be the one to do that.
But he's dating Sha Shan at the time, who we're going to talk about in a minute, and it's kind of all comes to a head when Ned Leeds finds out about Peter and Betty and Flash and Betty, and it's this whole big terrible love triangle thing, and their marriage finally truly dissolves when Betty suspects that Ned is the Hobgoblin. And when Ned dies, Betty suffers this mental break, and she falls prey to this cult, which Peter and Flash pull her out of. And I don't think ever since then Betty has never been quite so awful of a character. She just had a string of 100 issues where she was truly one of the most despicable characters in this comic.
I always love that Mark Waid story where I feel kind of repairs Betty and Peter, which is also known, it's the Obama issue for those playing at home. I think it's 587, which kind of paints their friendship in a new light. I feel a lot of people don't know how to touch that whole relationship. I mean, Roger Stern did a good job with it, and Hobgoblin Lives too. I feel that kind of redeems Betty to a degree. But man, again, in a very understandable problem, kind of like paints her in this really awful picture. I mean, I don't want to get too political here, Dan, but it does kind of like show how inadvertently like misogynistic these comics can be sometimes, you know?
Oh, for sure. There's some truly egregious stuff in that regard around this time. And Peter's relationship to women is something, it's a whole other topic for another time. He's got some real kind of like issues early on. I think they've done a good job of kind of turning him around a little bit in recent years, but there was a lot of time in like the 70s and 80s where he was just like not a character you wanted to read about in that regard.
So speaking of characters you may not want to read about, let's talk. What's our last featured story of this pod, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking like big stories that influence the history of Spider-Man that are, that aren't worth the whole episode, I don't even know if I would consider this a big story, but I thought it was worth mentioning. And it's the like relationship that establishes itself here during this run between Flash and Sha Shan, which I mentioned a second ago would go completely haywire, and we'll talk about that again here. But yeah, I think there's like a big kind of reinvention of Peter and Flash's relationship, and like a kind of way to move Flash away from being the kind of jerky jock Lothario that he was for such a long time. And so you can read these stories in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man 108, 109, and 138, and Spectacular Spider-Man, which we're going to be talking about in much greater detail in a coming episode. But the numbers 8, 13, 14, and 15. But yeah, give us some background to this, Mark.
The other reason why I think this story is important to note in the context of this episode is not only the Peter-Flash dynamic that got changed, but like I also feel like these are the first stories that really kind of gave some detail to Flash's Vietnam experience, which would come back also to kind of flesh out the character. Now, granted, the experience we get here is quite eye-opening, and not like the enlightening way, I would say. Like this story is like, I mean, this is I was joking with you before we were recording that this is like woke Stan Lee, which is kind of like I feel like the weirdest version of Stan Lee, because he's trying to like be edgy and current with his writing talking about Vietnam, but we get this story that like is like, it's not even borderline racist. This is like racist stuff. It's really offensive in retrospect and probably at the time. But yeah, so basically the way we are introduced to Sha Shan is Flash is giving a story about being in Vietnam. He meets Sha Shan and her father, who's like this mystic ruler of a holy temple, which is then destroyed by this guy's own people. And then Flash thinks they've been lost. He discovers that he's basically been captured to be sacrificed to awaken Sha Shan's father. In the midst of this, like they're described as being Oriental and so. I mean, like I said, this is just like really weird, offensive, racist stuff.
Yeah, and it's weird because on the other hand of that, the wokeness comes in the form that like Stan has the Americans destroy the temple. And so, like, Flash goes to warn Sha Shan and her father about this. So it's like him acknowledging at the very least that, like, Americans aren't necessarily a force for good in Vietnam, that they are kind of, like, wreaking havoc on innocent people. And so, like, that's interesting, but then it doesn't necessarily treat those people as, like, fully formed individuals beyond their kind of the sillier depictions of their culture. But yeah, I mean, that story is interesting, and that's pretty early on here, and that's like Stan Lee's stuff. I thought it was important to note also in issue 138, which people might remember as the Mindworm issue, Peter is like kicked out of his apartment after Harry Osborn destroys it, and he's forced to move in with like a friend, and the only one who will let him in is Flash Thompson, all the way out in Rockaway Beach. And to me, this was the start of like the change in Peter and Flash's relationship. Like, it got warmer when Romita came on the book and things like that. But in this issue, Peter truly acknowledges that, like, maybe he had misjudged Flash and that he's actually a good guy and that they might have more in common than he initially realized, which we would see play out, over, all the way up to issue 800 of Amazing Spider-Man. So I thought that was kind of important to note. And then Peter would obviously move into his more famously dumpy apartment with Miss Muggins later, where we meet Gloria Grant for the first time. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the end of this like initial story. But then, in the pages of Spectacular Spider-Man, we get like one of my favorite bonkers stories, which we're going to get into the full details of later in that episode. But tell us, what does this have to do with Flash and Sha Shan here?
Well, you only like this story because it's the first appearance of like your favorite supporting character in the history of comics, right?
Yes, Razorback. I love him. But,
you and Jason Latour, you could talk about this story forever.
Oh, it's so bonkers, and Razorback is like the cherry on top, you know. So, but yeah, so like Sha Shan reappears because, of course, she's now working at an Asian restaurant that Peter, Glory, and Flash attend. But it's weird because she denies that she's Sha Shan, and they kind of, I think, like overhear a guy in the back room like yelling at her to suppress her identity.
And then it turns out that she's married to this guy. It's Ahmed Korba. Is that am I saying that right? I don't know. And he is actually controlling her we're about to talk about another cult in this episode, Dan. This is, I think, another record in terms of cults. It's the Brother Power and Sister Moon cult.
Yeah, and they're like this like thing where only the husband and wife of this cult can summon forth magical powers, and they can brainwash people, and they end up going to the stadium where they like have this big rally. It's a lot to go into, which I promise you we're going to get into details on this because it's a favorite story of mine. But the important thing to know is that like Flash like discovers that Sha Shan is in this cult, and he uses their history together to kind of like de-brainwash her and pull her out of this like abusive marriage with Ahmed. And it just spirals into utter insanity, which we'll cover later, obviously. And after freeing her, Flash and Sha Shan begin this like moderately long-running romance.
Yeah, I mean, this thing goes for well over 100 issues, I believe, or you know, so I mean, a while. I mean, what eventually starts to disintegrate during the aforementioned affair between Flash and Betty Brant. This also features Flash basically being physically abusive to Sha Shan because, yet again, it's not bad enough that these characters are having an affair, but they also then have to become dirtbags, I guess, to truly consummate the badness of them.
And like Sha Shan, like, slaps Flash at one point. So like, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not justified, but it's a truly toxic relationship to the point that when Flash is accused of being the Hobgoblin, Sha Shan refuses to testify on his behalf, suggesting that he got what he deserved, even though she knows that he's not the Hobgoblin.
Eventually, Sha Shan does disappear for a while, but she does come back in the flashback issue where Flash loses his legs in the Iraq War. He's a patient for physical therapy, and she is the physical therapist, which is pretty cool. Yeah,
and she also ends up being the physical therapist for Aunt May during the Dan Slott run when her leg is injured. So I wouldn't say Sha Shan is like a hugely major character. She's probably like a B or C list character in the supporting cast, but she does pop back up every now and again. It's a woman of a variety of professional roles, right? She's like an assistant to like this monk. Then she works in an Asian food restaurant. Then she's like the head of a cult. And now she's a physical therapist. I'd love to see what that resume looks like.
I mean, hey, she made good on it. I mean, I'm not trying to be glib here, but I think, like, again, the purposes of us talking about this story is more about kind of how this positioned Flash in the Spider-Man universe. I feel that this kind of advanced his character. Sometimes, other times it kind of regressed his character a bit, but whatever.
That's Flash Thompson for you. I mean, his character oscillates from being like the noble friend that was misunderstood to being like a deeply troubled individual to being like super soldier Venom guy, which is like kind of a combination of both of those things. But like, that's what's cool about Flash is he turned out to being like quite a deep and fully fleshed out character, at least in terms of Spider-Man's supporting cast. It's weird that he's gone now.
Yeah, for now. Well, Dan, speaking of weird, I think it's weird that we're about to wrap this episode up, right?
Truly, Mark. Truly the weirdest thing you've said today.
That's my greatest transition ever. No, thank you for joining us for our 7th episode of the 3rd season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, what's coming down the pike for the show, man?
Well, by the time you are listening to this, I will have seen Spider-Man Far From Home early. And Mark, you're seeing it a few days later in an early screening. So we're going to come back and give you our spoiler-free early thoughts on Spider-Man Far From Home, just like we did with Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, Dan, that for like the first time ever, I think, for one of these live action movies at least, I'm actually going to get to see it well in advance of the movie opening instead of 2 weeks afterwards like I normally see them.
People actually listened to that episode this time.
Yeah, right? There we go.
What else is coming out for everybody to listen to?
Well, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed for a special review of Amazing Spider-Man number 23. Remember, folks, there is no better time and place to join on the Patreon bandwagon than for our exciting coverage of this current run. For just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to exclusive new issue reviews, sworn B-book reviews, extended interviews, mailbags, and more. And for $10 or more a month, you'll get access to some awesome commissioned artwork this season from Barry Kitson.
Awesome. Just a reminder again to check out our sister show, The Untold Talks of Spider-Man. Get all caught up in that. I actually talked to Matt this morning, and, he's starting to kind of like get all of his stuff back in gear after the floods and stuff that were going on. So I think that show will be back very shortly. It sounds like they're kind of gearing back up for that. But in the meantime, please check out the amazing Spider Slack community. It's our Slack group. It's like a kind of mobile phone version of a forum where I'm always in there talking to everybody. We have a great time. I think there's like now over 200 people in our Slack, and we're constantly talking about Spider-Man and comics and everything in general. So check out this episode's description. There's a link right in there. You can click on it, and it will have you fill out your name, and you can join our Spider-Man Talkin' community. Mark, if people wanted to keep up with you, where could they do so on the internet?
Well, as promised in our last episode, Dan, I've been a little more engaged on Twitter lately, so you can follow me there at Chasing ASM Blog. And of course, you can always get my book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. We wrote this book before the first movie, but hey, why don't you go read it before Far From Home and get some other info about Mysterio and people like that?
Yeah, it truly is kind of like the show Bible for everything we talk about on here. So if you want to get a bit of a jump start, check out Mark's book.
And Dan, where can we find you online?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at SupSpiderTalk, talking about Spider-Man all live long day. That's sup, like what's up, Spider Talk. And also over on AmazingSpiderTalk.com. And like I said earlier, our Slack. I'm just kind of everywhere you could think to find me in regards to podcasting and talking about Spider-Man. But if there's one thing that's most important to talk about Spider-Man regarding, it's the motto that is the lifeblood of our show. Mark, what is our motto?
Well, of course, that motto is, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.